right, welcome back to part 3B. We'll just keep on going. It's going to be a different subject now about the presidency, mostly national security stuff here. So we'll start with the idea of what we call executive orders. These are much more common than they used to be. So just to make sure we understand, an executive order is something issued by the president. It affects the executive branch only. But then the executive branch is essentially what runs government, right? So it's essentially instructions on how to run something. Okay, they have the full force of law, and they are subject to judicial review. So there are some checks and balances in there. They usually are routine, and that's really where they began. They have to do with internal running of various departments and things like that. Here, do this, execute the law this way, blah blah blah. Sometimes they are controversial. There are plenty of them. The Emancipation Proclamation was an executive order. It was just issued to the executive department, declaring the slaves that were in the states in rebellion that they were free. Japanese internment in World War II. That was strictly an executive order. 9066, I think, was the number. Executive Order 9066, if I remember correctly. That did that. Obviously controversial. Desegregating the military. President Truman, executive order. The executive branch runs the military. He's the commander in chief. He said, "This is what we're going to do." And so desegregating the military, didn't wait for Congress to do it or anything like that. Guantanamo Bay, the set up of Guantanamo Bay by President Bush, done by executive order. And I don't know why I have immigration in there twice, but immigration issues are done by executive order, and a lot of those have been controversial. The extending of allowing overstays for when President Obama did it for what they called the Dreamers. All that stuff with the Dreamers was all done by executive order. Okay, Congress does have some options. They can pass legislation to counter those, or they can refuse to fund them, and that's really their big tool is funding, but they hardly ever use it. Talk about that with the War Powers Act here shortly as well. So additional national security stuff. The president is the chief diplomat. So that means they confer diplomatic recognition. So this is part of the enumerated powers of the president as stated in Article 2. Teddy Roosevelt and Panama. Carter and China versus Taiwan. Carter decided to recognize China and de-recognize Taiwan. Teddy Roosevelt, that story is really interesting. Panama was part of Colombia for a long time until the Panama Canal started being an idea, and then what President Roosevelt did was start to work a little bit behind the scenes with the Panamanian rebels. They'd been rebelling against Colombia for a long time, wanted to be their own country. And he basically set up the idea that he'd have the Navy there ready. If they rebelled and declared independence, he would recognize them, and then things would go further. Because once, especially when the United States, even back in the early 1900s, when the United States diplomatically recognizes somebody, that's a big deal. Okay, if Uganda does, not a big deal. The United States does, a very big deal in the world. All right, they can terminate as well. Carter terminated our diplomatic relations with Iran, which they are still terminated. They negotiate treaties, of course. They sometimes lose. Remember, they can negotiate the treaties, but the Senate then has to ratify the treaty. So remember, and that takes 2/3 of the Senate. Sometimes they lose. Wilson in the Treaty of Versailles. He set up, essentially, was a big part of setting up the treaty that ended World War I, and then the United States ended up not being part of it because the Senate did not ratify it. Carter and SALT II, Senate, that Strategic Arms Limitation Talks version 2. The Senate never ratified. Clinton in the Kyoto Accords. He never even presented them to Congress for ratification, or to the Senate for ratification, because he knew it was not going to win. Elsewhere with national security, let's talk about executive agreements, something that is always confused with executive orders, so make sure you don't confuse them. Agreements between the president and the head of a foreign government. That's what an executive agreement is, if that makes sense. They do not, and this is the important part, and this is the analysis portion, they do not require Senate approval. This is why they are used a lot. So they may seem like a treaty, but they're not. They may require implementing legislation, though, so sometimes they do need the cooperation of Congress. Most, however, are routine dealing with non-controversial subjects, things like forces, status of forces acts and things like that. That'd be a military thing. Establishing agreements with, say, Great Britain about our military being stationed there or Germany or what have you. However, sometimes they're controversial. So Vietnam and the peace deal that ended Vietnam was something that President Nixon signed with the leader of Vietnam. And it was an executive agreement. SALT I was an executive agreement, not a treaty. Iran nuclear deal that was since terminated by Trump was not an executive agreement. And for that matter, President Obama knew that he could not get a treaty through Congress or through the Senate. So he didn't even bother. But then they can be terminated by a subsequent president, which obviously President Trump did with that nuclear deal when he took office. So remember, they can be terminated by a subsequent president. So that's the key there. So more commander-in-chief issues, more national security. Sorry, civilian control of the military is a concept we have had since the beginning. It was very, very important to the framers that we have civilian control of the military, and we do, and it works. Two presidents, though, if you want to take a look at it, then of course they have actually led troops in combat. They are the commander-in-chief, right? Two presidents have done that: George Washington and James Madison. Washington led troops for a short time during the Whiskey Rebellion, and then Madison during the War of 1812. They do command nowadays a large standing military, 1.2, 1.3 million standing military. That's actually just military people, not counting the civilians that work for the Department of Defense. They deal with huge defense commitments around the world. I mean, this is a massive, major job. And of course, they control the nuclear arsenal. Very, very important. All right, so let's talk about the most controversial part of this sync power, and that's the War Powers Act. Okay, that's war powers, period, have been a contentious issue between the legislative and executive branches, and of course the reason is Congress declares war, right? It's always been that way. It's been that way from the beginning. The president then fights the war. So obviously contentious issues, because remember, again, Congress declares war, they fund war, it is their job. Okay. There has been, however, a long accepted practice of president making short-term military commitments without declaring war. Okay, so that then gets us. Remember, war has not been declared since World War II. I think we've had 5 declared wars in our history. We've obviously had more than 5 wars. And again, all of that stuff, Korea, Vietnam, all of the stuff that's happened, Iran, Iraq, Iraq, Kuwait, all those things, Afghanistan, that war has not been declared since World War II, yet we've had them. So the disillusion with Vietnam was the cause for Congress to pass this thing that we're going to talk about, the War Powers Act, in 1973. They were so insistent upon it that they overrode President Nixon's veto. So remember, those are hard to do. It takes 2/3 of both houses. So it really was important to Congress. And of course, the president's going to veto that because he doesn't want any infringement on his power. That's the separation of powers. That's Federalist 51. They're going to jealously guard their own power and all of that stuff. So it was intended to give Congress a greater voice, and that was the issue. So what did it do? The idea is, so here's what the particulars are. The presidents must consult with Congress when possible before the use of military force. Okay, that's the initial setup. The president must, by this act, withdraw troops after 60 days unless war is declared by Congress or Congress grants a 30-day extension. So consider this, we have not declared war, and we've been in Afghanistan for 19 years. Okay. Congress can pass a resolution at any time that's not subject to veto to end U.S. participation. That is called a legislative veto, which Congress passing legislation to override a presidential decision. That's specifically in the War Powers Act. So that's something that can happen with that. Doesn't necessarily be able to happen all the time. All right. So it did not really work as Congress intended, and this is key. Okay. All presidents, every president since it passed, from Nixon to Carter on through, every president has asserted that the War Powers Act is unconstitutional. Okay, they all have said that. It is an infringement on their sync power. That's what they say, and they may be right. Most presidents have not complied fully or ignored totally, and that's what has happened here. Congress has very little leverage. This is the issue. They wanted more leverage. They tried to get more leverage, but they really don't have a lot here. Congress would have to sue the president, say, you're violating the War Powers Act. We're going to take you to court. Okay, the Supreme Court's going to say, they're going to say, nope, they're either going to rule for the president saying it's a violation of separation of powers, Or they're going to say it looks political, and that's probably what they would do and say, this is a political issue between you guys settle it. Remember that doctrine of political questions. That's most likely what they would do. The bottom line, though, is neither side has an incentive to take it to court. So because Congress might not have an incentive because they don't want to lose. The president might not want to do it because they actually might lose too. Probably not, but they might. So what happens is both sides pretend that they abide by it. And they do. The president will sometimes say, hey, I'm doing this, and they'll follow and say, okay, within 48 hours, I got to tell you. Okay, so I'm telling you, but then they basically dare Congress to do anything about it. And that's the thing. Congress would have to defund it, and that looks bad. Because all the president would have to go to the public and say, look, Congress doesn't want to pay their troops, because that's what they would have to do. They're getting paid. They don't want to give them supplies. They don't want to feed them. They don't want to make sure they have their bullets, and it would work. So both sides sort of pretend they complain about it, and Congress will go, you can't do that, and all that. But in the end, it's what happens. So some recent examples, and George H.W. Bush will set this up really quick, and then we'll see some other examples. Panama. We went into Panama in 1989 and extracted the president of Panama and brought him back for trial as a drug trafficker. That was not, of course, authorized by Congress, but President Bush did it. Desert Shield setting up after Saddam Hussein in Iraq took over Kuwait, setting up Desert Shield. The President Bush set that up without a declaration of war, and then of course Desert Storm, the actual war portion of that. The Democrats, before that happened, insisted he did not have the authority to commit troops to combat. And so the President Bush, decided, okay, we're going to go to Congress and ask for authority for the use of force. So not a declaration of war. So Congress passed with a close vote what they call an authorization for the president to use military force in Kuwait and Iraq. So that's what they did. So is it war or is it not war? And that's really where we're at. Congress said go ahead and do it. So the president did it without a formal saying we declare war. Okay, so the last set, just a bunch of examples here. Clinton, both in Haiti, he sent troops into Haiti and dared Congress to stop him. Congress, of course, did not. They complained about it, but they didn't stop him. Serbia authorized sustained air attacks. Congress could not even agree on an authorization for the use of force, so there wasn't one. He just continued to do it. George W. Bush, after 9/11, Congress easily passed a use of force resolution to go against the perpetrators of 9/11. And then shortly after that, also approved use of force, a little closer vote for Iraq in 2003. But again, not declarations of war, authorizations for the use of force. So the War Powers Act, it might be working, might not be working, but there it is. And then, of course, we have Obama with Libya and with Syria and with ISIS. Going no formal declarations of war, of course. And then with President Trump, we also have ISIS issues and Syria as well. So that's the end of this portion of part 3. So you'll have one assignment to do, and then we'll get to part 4 and end it. And then for my in-person students, we'll be back. When we get back, it'll be quiz day for your online guys. Of course, it'll be quiz day then too. All right, take it easy, have fun, and